Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Life in Kerby, Oregon, a retrospective on the turbulent 1960s, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Leah Pastizo, Digital Services Specialist. This program is being recorded, so please mute your microphone and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording. There will be time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Naucke people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. And now I'll hand it over to Larry.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Larry Mullally, and I welcome you on behalf of the Southern Oregon Historical Society. Today's speaker is one of our longtime favorites. We always feel blessed to have him back, Paul Fattig. Paul is a recovering print journalist, he says. He was raised in Kerby, Southern Oregon. He served in the United States Marines. He has his degree in journalism from the University of Oregon, and he's worked in newspapers from Alaska to California for many years, retiring in 2013. He's the author of 3 books and is now rapidly finishing. He's working on his 4th book. And with that, I'm happy to introduce Paul in today's talk, Life in Kerby, Oregon, a retrospective of the turbulent 1960s. Paul?
Well, thank you. You know, Larry, you could just read this and I can run out and have lunch. So before I start, I would like to introduce a couple of people. And one is Ron Brudd. And Ron, if you could raise your hand. He was my high school principal more than half a century ago, and a finer person I've yet to meet. But I am glad that my speech teacher at Illinois Valley High School isn't here, because I would probably be grabbed by the ear and led out the room. Another person I wanted to introduce was John Decker. John, if you would raise your hand. John grew up in Kerby, and like me, I think he's still working on the growing up part a little bit. John is of Modoc ancestry. His great-great-grandmother was Wainema, for whom the Wainema National Forest was named. And I've got a couple of people here from my class, Kathy Males and her husband, Tom. Tom was a retired principal from Lorna Byrne Middle School out in Cave Junction. And then Randy Bryant, his dad was one of my teachers in Kerby Elementary, a good teacher.
My sister Rita is here.
Pardon me?
My sister Rita is here.
Oh, okay. Hi. I haven't seen you in half a century. So anyway, I'm glad you're all here. Now, I should tell you, I'm going to tell an anecdote down the road, and in which an old friend of mine uses a word that is, well, you would hear it in Kerby a lot. And anyway, I'll let it go. I'm going to repeat it twice, but there's no little kids here. So with that, I'm going to start. When I was a lad, Kerby had a well-deserved reputation for producing ruffians. Indeed, back in those days, drivers approaching Kerby often gritted their teeth, rolled up their windows, and locked their doors. After all, they knew they were about to enter rough country. Now, Kathy, she was our neighbor when I was a kid. So
know this.
you didn't, but you knew you had ruffians for neighbors.
Oh, sure.
Yes, yeah. So, by the way, are there any Kerby expats from my era out there? And there are. If so, I trust that you checked your weapons at the door. So no weapons, Kathy, right? John, Randy, nothing? Okay. Okay, I have to tell you that my wonderful wife, Maureen, knowing by our friends as the brains in the outfit, suggested I rein in my juvenile jokes today. And that's coming from someone who calls me an Ivy Leaguer because I went to Illinois Valley High School. That's a horrible joke. You got it. Jeez. Anyway, she specifically admonished me not to tell the marriage joke. You haven't heard that one, right? That's where they say that married men live longer, but it's not true. It just seems longer. I'm very happily married. Okay, so I've been shoveling a bit of what a journalism professor of mine at the University of Oregon would refer to as happy horse hockey. There's one word for that, but we won't go there. But nonetheless, it is true that Kerby was a mite rowdy back in the day. Now, at first glance, Kerby appears to be a sleepy little place, but I'll have you know it was once the Josephine County seat before Grants Pass stole the title. That was back in the 1800s, of course. Now, although it was originally Kerbyville, named for a settler, James Kerby, it became known as Napoleon for a short time. That was because Dr. Holton, a Civil War surgeon who settled in Kerby after the war, waged a successful campaign to change the name to Napoleon. Now, he apparently had a bad sense of humor because his rationale was that every Josephine needed a Napoleon. I love that joke. But the name was reverted to Kerby after about 2 years. It's too bad Napoleon has a nice ring to it. But I think it would have left it with a Napoleonic complex. Incidentally, my talk will include the counterculture moving into the Illinois Valley in the late 1960s, since it impacted Kerby as well as the rest of the region. But you could argue their presence and the overreaction by some Ivy residents was responsible for much of our turbulence in the late 1960s. So one night, many years ago, an old childhood chum called me to reminisce about our Kerby days. I was still a working journalist at the time, but I was already working on a book about my Kerby roots, which remains a work in progress. It's odd. That's the first book I started writing. I've written 3 others, and I've yet to finish the one that I started out first. So I'm going to try to keep it under 1,000 pages. So we'll go back to that night. This guy calls. He says, "Hey, Paul, how you doing?" Rumbled the deep voice on the other end of the line. It was Cliff Phillips, my best friend since 2nd grade at Kerby Elementary School. Built like a grizzly, he was the toughest kid I ever knew. "Real good, Cliff," I managed to blurt out before he was off and running. Now, the thing you have to understand about Cliff, but he was a born storyteller. When he called, it was best to listen patiently. Besides, he always had something interesting to impart. "Hey, do you remember when we were kids in Kerby sitting in the swings in front of the elementary school and talking about what we were going to do when we got the hell out of here?" That's not the word I warned you about. He was referring to the late 1960s when we were teenagers in turbulent times. We would sit on the swings, watch the traffic go by, and bitch and moan about the sorry state of affairs. Local young men, only a few years older than us, were being drafted and sent off to fight in Vietnam. In fact, I remember several who were killed in Vietnam. And meanwhile, the counterculture movement was beginning to move in from urban areas.
settling into the old logging and mining community of Takilma. Many longtime residents complained about what they called those damned hippie invaders. And that's not the other word that I was warning about. Sure, I remember those days, I said, and started to mention that at least we were able to hear the radio played Roger Miller's 1965 hit song, King of the Road. Once again, he cut me off the pass. Cliff had a story in him screaming to get out. Sorry, I'm a bit of a Luddite. That's why I'm using paper. And I could tell you about Ned Ludd, what he started back in the UK back in 1848, where he was trying to stop this horrible modernization effort. And they were bringing these trains into the area, and they were steam powered. But I digress again. So back to Cliff. I remember telling you that when I grew up, I was going to leave this shithole and never come back, he said. Well, I was just thinking about Chu Lai and what happened when I was there. Chu Lai is a village in Vietnam not far from Da Nang. Cliff was there with an Army infantry unit in 1970 during the Vietnam War. Now, as it happens, I visited Chu Lai as a journalist more than 2 decades after he left Vietnam. If Kerby had rice paddies with an occasional water buffalo instead of a few white-faced cows munching in the stubble of a hayfield, it could have been a sister city to Chu Lai. Neither one could be described as a city, of course. They were rural hamlets just trying to survive on opposite sides of this blue planet of ours. The rural values shared by the denizens of each are surprisingly similar. But Cliff didn't call to discuss social traits common to rural inhabitants around the globe. When I was there, I remember stopping and thinking about everything, kind of like we used to do on those swings in Kerby, he continued. Our unit had a pretty bad day with a couple of guys killed. I just carried the last body bag to the helicopter. I just stood there. That's when I told myself, when I leave this shithole, I'm going back to Kerby and I ain't ever leaving. It lasted the bad words. I just had kind of a weak moment there because I gave the eulogy for Cliff when he died at the end of 2019. And it was at former Kerby Elementary School. It was pretty sad. But anyway, going back to his comment, with that, Cliff let out a rumbling laugh. We chatted for a few minutes more, agreed to get together when the trout were biting, and told each other to take care. I sat there for a while, jotting down his comments. Now, if you were overly fussy about details, you could argue that he never actually returned to Kerby because he bought a house along the Illinois River a few miles south of Cave Junction. But he was definitely in the vicinity. Cliff was the son of a logger hailing from Pennsylvania and an Indian lady born in the Klamath River drainage of far northern California. Cliff's uncle by marriage was an African-American named Lonnie Dixon. Lonnie hired Cliff and me several times to cut firewood for his house. A logger, he could have easily cut his own wood, but he knew that we needed the money. He was a good guy who had grown up in the Kerby area. And by the way, I remember him talking about the hippies. That's what we referred to all those folks who were living out in Takilma as hippies. And originally, I think it had a kind of a derogatory edge to it, but it became something that they even used. And it was accepted. But I later realized that Lonnie said he kind of had empathy for them. I can't remember the word he used, but and I think it was because he knew what it felt like to be treated like a second-class citizen, and that makes me angry to think about that he had to endure that, and he did back in the Illinois Valley at times. Anyway,
So my family's roots also tap deep into the Illinois Valley dirt. My paternal grandparents, who had homesteaded in the Applegate Valley, moved to Holland in 1920, where they farmed for several decades. That would be the hamlet in the Illinois Valley, not the country with windmills in the Netherlands. My paternal grandparents moved from Washington to the valley in the 1930s. And by the way, my maternal grandmother, Lela Ingersoll Cooke, owned and lived in the historic Naucke house before it became part of the Kerbyville Museum and History Center. And that would be the big white house with white columns next to that excellent museum. Gesundheit. I know one word of German. Actually, I know two, and it starts with Scheiss, and I won't finish it. So, after my paternal grandparents settled on the Holland farm, my father had gone to the 8th grade in the Applegate Valley. And by the way, he was born June 17th, 1906 in Ashland. But anyway, when they moved out there, he could no longer go to school because the nearest high school was Kerby Union High School, about, I think it's about 10 miles distance. There were no buses back then. But he was already an avid reader, a healthy habit that continued throughout his life. While living with his parents, he worked on the farm by day and read each evening. Now, if I'm getting too deep into local history, just raise your hand, but don't throw any tomatoes at things, please. After he eventually met and married the gentle lady who became my mother, he continued reading, collecting a rich variety of books, especially books about botany. But he became a logger to make ends meet. After he lost his right leg in a logging accident, my parents moved uptown to Kerby in 1958. Uptown is supposed to be a joke. Anyway, despite having lost his leg above the knee, our father was no quitter. A self-taught botanist, he built a small greenhouse and began growing rare plants, including orchids. I have no doubt that he was the only one-legged former logger turned botanist who grew orchids in Oregon, let alone Kerby. And I'm wearing this shirt today in his memory. Most of you are familiar with cobra plants. And the Latin term for that, my dad taught me this when I was a boy, and I'm a junior. I was named after him. And by the way, we have 5 kids altogether in our family. My parents had their first son, Jim, and Ron will remember him. And then, gosh, was it 2 years later, they had their first set of twins. And then 14 months later, they had their second set of twins. So my parents had 5 kids in 3.5 years. And then they moved away and never spoke to us. No, I'm joking. But anyway, that was amazing. And they got married kind of late in life. So made up for lost time. But anyway. But sadly, our father died of cancer early in 1961 when my twin and I were 9. My twin and I were the youngest. We were already living lean since the greenhouse brought in very little money. Now we were the poorest family in Kerby, which was one of the poorest communities in the county. Times were hard. The Illinois Valley I knew in my youth was a conservative area where most of the jobs were in local sawmills, logging woods, farming, or ranching. There were still some mining activity, but its heyday had long since passed. Short haircuts were standard. In fact, back then, this would have been considered just a little bit longish back in the early 60s. But anyway, the only time I recall seeing beards before the counterculture arrived was during the state centennial in 1959, when many men grew beards to celebrate 100 years of statehood. Does anyone in there know what date that,
Valentine's Day,
very good, Larry.
daughter's birthday, mom's birthday. I thought we're married on Valentine's Day.
Maureen, did you bring the duct tape?
So
No, I
who's
just,
talking?
this is Larry Smith, who's a retired teacher who,
Who said?
he's also, he's an identical twin.
Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot. Can you repeat what you just said for the online? audience?
Yes, please do.
Oh.
Yes, please do.
You want to know if there was anybody else, but Valentine's Day was Oregon State birthday, but also my daughter was born on Valentine's Day. My in-laws were married on Valentine's Day. Our dog was born on Valentine's Day.
Okay, smart Alec. What other state has a state, has statehood birthday on February 19th?
14.
What?
14.
14th, yes. Arizona. Yeah, but it was like 1909 or something. But anyway, I digress once more. Sorry. So. Anyway, so I remember being disappointed back then in 1959 that my dad didn't grow facial hair beyond his pencil thin mustache. When he was living up in Alaska in the late 1920s, early 30s, he grew a big beard because he was out of Fairbanks and it was really cold. And my friend Paul Tipton actually looks a lot like my dad did right back then. Okay, the short-haired world was rocked by the arrival of the counterculture folks, which began in interest in early 1968. The men typically had long hair and sandals. Both men and women wore colorful clothing never before seen in the valley. They often traveled in Volkswagen vans adorned with peace signs. Their most famous slogan was "Make love, not war." But fights periodically broke out between the peaceniks and the long-time valley residents. Proponents of the alternative lifestyle were blamed for increased drug use within the valley, which already had an alcohol abuse problem. In 1990, the Daily Courier published a 3-day series titled The Takelma Experiment, quoting one Takelma resident, recalling how the community in 1969 was of two factions. One seriously trying to form a viable alternative community, while the other was the partying group. Oregon newspaper reported in 1968 that bearded, barefooted hippies were moving into the Illinois Valley. A Josephine County sheriff commented that hippies were detrimental to any community. Signs soon appeared in store windows proclaiming, "We do not solicit hippie patronage." Bad things happened. And I remember in early March of 1969, I had wrestled in high school and was okay as a wrestler, and I qualified for the state tournament and was up there with another guy, Bruce Corgill, who was also qualified, and it was at Oregon State University. And you're wondering, why am I talking about this? I'll tell you in a second. Anyway, so we were up at OSU, and Wayne Thornhill, our coach, was up there with us, and our assistant coach was a guy named Lee Rosenberg, who had wrestled at Oregon State back in his college days. Anyway, I remember Lee coming over to Wayne and talking to him kind of off to the side, but I had big ears back then, as I do now, and I was listening to him. And Lee said, "Well, there's been some things happening down in the Illinois Valley." He said, "Somebody burned down the pyramid out in Takelma and caused quite an uproar." And I thought, oh my God. Two people in my class whose names I will not mention, none of them are here today, neither one, had told me that they were going to do something out in Takelma. And it turns out they were the ones that started that fire. And I've got to talk to my brother-in-law, since he's an attorney, about the statutes of limitations. But I think they're probably okay now, although they deserve to be. And I'll tell you later, Kathy, who they were. Anyway, so bad things were happening. Now, one fellow who remembers those years is Dave Atkin, a classmate of mine from the 5th grade at Kerby Elementary School through high school. He is now a retired attorney in Eugene, where he taught for a decade at the University of Oregon Law School and is the founder of the university's Environmental Law Center. His family arrived in the Valley in 1960. His father, Ed Atkin, was the owner and pharmacist at the drugstore in Cave Junction. Now here's a quote from Dave. When the hippie movement started to crumble in urban areas, starting the Back to the Land movement, they went to some very specific areas, and Takelma was one of them. I remember early on seeing some funny dressed people hitchhiking along the road, but I developed admiration for how hard they were working to become farmers, build their own houses, and got through those first tough winters in tents. Still, many in the valley were not impressed. Another Dave quote's coming up. To a lot of people who lived in the valley for many years, it seemed like an invasion, he said. The newcomers dressed differently and had different values. It was hugely threatening to a lot of those local residents. As a result, a group called the Illinois Valley Betterment Association was formed, he said. And one of the things he did was went to every store in Cave Junction and said, we've got to stop those hippies. They are bringing drugs in. They will destroy our kids, Dave told me. And they started passing out signs saying, we do not solicit hippie patronage. As a result, hippies were often treated like they were second-class citizens. He recalled one store owned by a Jewish family that refused to put up the sign. As a result, the store had its windows broken out and the tires slashed on the owner's vehicles, he said. And that happened to be the Rosenberg's lumber store down not far from the high school. Now, when members of the association entered the pharmacy, Ed Atkin refused to hang the sign. In fact, he later hired one of the counterculture folks to work for him. I remember we had bought a little place out near Takelma, which had an old homesteader's cabin on it, Dave said. One of the communes was right across the road. One time when we went out there, we came to a roadblock where people had rifles. The issue was because a hippie using an outhouse toilet had reputedly taken a gun away from a deputy who tried to stop him from using the outhouse. This is according to Dave. And I can't quite envision that, but anyway, I'm trying not to envision that. So Dave recalled being told about the time when some local young toughs went to Takelma, pointed guns at hippies, and threatened them. The latter later responded with guns of their own, resulted in several local teenagers nearly being shot, he said. And he said that included 3 kids out joyriding to Takelma. And they were almost shot. Things were obviously getting out of hand. One of those 3 kids was one of our classmates, Michael Gibney. Actually was a good guy, and I think he just happened to be out there. I think he was a good student, wasn't he, Ron? Anyway. So Dave said things were getting out of hand. And at that point, both sides started trying to ease tensions. After a few years, the hippies started working in Cave Junction, he continued. After a while, it was hard to tell who was on which side. A simulation had begun. Hailing from Huntington Beach in Southern California, Dilbert and Helen Kaufman were on the vanguard of the hippie movement, arriving in Takelma in June of 1968. And I called Helen the other day and got some comments from her. And she said it was quite a drastic change, she said, and she's now a retired Takelma Dome teacher, Takelma Dome school teacher. We had never even been to Oregon before. A friend had already arrived here, wrote us a letter about a beautiful valley he had found. He told us we should come up. At the time, the Kaufmans were married and had 3 little children, including a 6-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 6-week-old. There was a lot of resistance to the counterculture people, she remembered. It was mostly because of the way we looked. You had guys with long hair and earrings, for instance. And many Cave Junction businesses balked at allowing the newcomers into their stores, she remembered. They put up those signs saying they did not want us in their stores. But they came to accept us over the years. Dilbert cut firewood for a long time. Being fair and square with the old timers, he earned a good reputation. People said, Dilbert is one of the good hippies. In fact, Dilbert, who is now 90, was known as the de facto mayor of Takelma. Takelma was never a established community with a city council mayor and anything like that. But anyway, the couple eventually started Kaufman Wood Products at the old sawmill site in Kerby, which they operated for 15 years, manufacturing log furniture. We had a great time in Kerby, she said. People supported us there. The fact a lot of the Takelma newcomers were educated helped ease the initial resistance, she observed. Many had college degrees. She said, as they settled in, people started going back to their professions like engineering and teaching. That really helped bridge the gap. When you have skills, you can help other people. All told, the Kaufmans have now lived in Takelma for more than half a century. We love it here, she said. We embrace this community. For us, it was a great place to raise our children. All 6 of our children have college degrees, including 2 with doctorates. That is very impressive. Now, one person who arrived in Takelma early in 1973 had a medical degree. That was Dr. Jim Shames, who helped create the Takelma People's Clinic. Hailing from the East Coast, he attended medical school in Philadelphia, then went to Portland in 1972, where he was working with the health department there while waiting to start his psychiatric residency at Oregon Health Sciences University. That was when Takelma had a big hepatitis outbreak, he recalled. Some people I knew in Portland suggested I go down to Takelma and work with them, since he had some time before he would be starting his OHSU residency. He headed down to the other end of the state. I made a deal with the Takelma community leaders that if they could find the space and people who wanted to figure out how to establish a healthcare clinic, then I would provide my medical expertise, he said. Fortunately, the Takelma community had a lot of intelligent people who were willing to learn what they had to learn to establish a clinic. Working quickly, they were able to open the medical clinic in the spring of 1972. What became immediately clear was there was a tremendous need. Once I got there, I started doing a lot of stuff, including surgeries and births. It was needed work, and I really liked it. He decided to do primary medical care instead of becoming a psychiatrist. When I got to the valley, a lot of people were a little resentful or suspicious of the newcomers. He acknowledged it was certainly a clash of cultures. Yet doctors in the region were happy to have his and the clinic's help in treating the counterculture community, he said. The lightning caused 1987 longwood fire burning in the Tacoma area, forced the clinic, now called the Siskiyou Community Health Center, to move into Cave Junction. It has since spawned a sister clinic in Grants Pass. We evolved and had a more formal structure, he said. By and large, the response was very positive. Now, Dr. Shames, whose two oldest children were born in Tacoma, was named Doctor Citizen of the Year in 2012 by the Oregon Medical Association. And he recently retired as the Jackson County Medical Director after nearly 20 years of service. In addition to the clinic, Tacoma residents created the aforementioned Tacoma Dome School, the Illinois Valley Fire District's Tacoma Station, the Siskiyou Regional Education Project, and the Jefferson Baroque Orchestra. The latter was created in 1994 by the late Jim Rich, who was a talented violin player who also had a job that I bet none of you will guess what it was. He was the blacksmith for Tacoma. So here he was, a violin player and a blacksmith. I love that combination. Anyway, Rich, who was also in charge of the Tacoma Fire Station, told me in an interview shortly after the 1987 Longwood Fire that many people from throughout the valley came out to help Tacoma residents battle the blaze. It was then that he realized Tacoma residents had friends throughout the valley. That ability to work together was also demonstrated in 1996 when state officials announced that a site near Tacoma and Cave Junction was being considered for a new 1,600-bed medium security prison. Tacoma residents and the rest of the Illinois Valley united to oppose the effort, and working together stopped the project in its tracks. Now, thanks to people reaching out on both sides, the assimilation Dave Atkins spoke of, while not complete, has made impressive progress in half a century. And as a former Kerby kid, that gives me hope. Now, at the outset, I had mentioned some positive things, Ron Brudd and the rest of you folks being part of that. I can't end this without mentioning something wonderful that happened to me back in those turbulent times. So at precisely 5:30 p.m., April 6, 1968, I saw the most beautiful young lady I had ever seen up till then and since then. And that would be my wife, Maureen. And unfortunately, the Marine Corps got in the way of some other things, but we've been married for 35 years now. But yes, it does seem longer. Sorry, I had to get that last joke in.